The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the North American Invasive Species Management Association's webinar with the National Park Service. I am Krista Lutsky. I am the Play Clean Go Program Manager with NASMA. And today we have how the National Park Service integrates partnerships, prevention, and management of invasive species. Within the realm of invasive species management, partnerships and collaboration are increasingly essential for success. Collaboration occurs at all levels within the National Park Service. It takes many forms, involves a range of partners, including other agencies, states, tribes, and cooperative weed management areas, and must reach beyond our boundaries to address the issues that invasive species pose to our public lands. This webinar will showcase examples of successful invasive plant management that are achieved through partnership efforts, including prevention and restoration within the National Park Service. Prior to introducing our speakers today, I just want to let everybody know that this will be recorded and available on the nasma.org website, and we will also have time for questions at the end of the session. Feel free to enter your questions in on the chat box or question box, and I will share them at the end. Today, our presenter is Terri Hogan. Terri is a plant ecologist and the national lead for the National Park Service Invasive Plant Program that addresses threats posed by invasive plant species to National Park Service resources. In this capacity, she oversees the National Park Service Exotic Plant Management Team program that provides boots-on-the-ground invasive plant management support and expertise to parks. She also has natural and cultural resource management experience in national parks and has worked on landscape scale collaborative efforts. Terri has been working in the field of botany and plant ecology for nearly 30 years, having begun her career focusing on rare plant species in southeastern U.S. Her co-presenter today is Damien Ossie, the wildlife biologist with the Department of Energy and Environment. And with that, we will get started. Welcome, Terri and Damien.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us today. We will be talking about partnerships and how we integrate partnerships into prevention and management of invasive species. And I first wanted to give you an outline of what we'll be talking about. So I want to just do a quick overview of advantages and challenges of partnering, talk briefly about NPS authority and support for partnering and collaboration, and then give you some examples on a range of scales of how we collaborate across different agencies and with NGOs and volunteers. And then I'm going to hand it over to Damien, who will give more details about one of the partnerships that I'll be introducing. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the 2020 Invasive Plant Management Team Program's anniversary. The program will be observing 20 years of action in the year 2020, and we have a number of events associated with that, and then we'll open it up for questions. So first, I wanted to just remind everyone what the Park Service manages. We manage natural landscapes, which include these iconic, large-scale landscapes in Alaska and large wilderness areas, but we are also responsible for cultural landscape management, including protecting ethnographic resources. And there are a range of reasons why we engage in partnerships and collaboration for conservation success. And they include that engaging partners provides opportunities to develop a shared understanding of the processes that we use to manage public lands. Bringing in perspectives from collaborators and partners allow us to approach problem solving collectively. and look outside of the Bureau for perspectives. Stewards are also grown through these partnerships and collaborations that help oversee the protection of public lands well into the future. And working with partners increases the resources that are available to manage public lands. There are some challenges of partnering and collaborating, which everyone should be mindful when you embark on a collaborative effort, because you should be prepared to address them early on. And these include things like lack of time, resources, opportunity and support, and even lack of vision. But some of the bigger challenges are actually addressing differing priorities and missions of the partners, even differing language, use of language and ways of communicating. And it really requires navigating everyone's requirements. So you look for the intersections across the partnerships so that everyone's needs can be fulfilled. And it really is best to address those early so that they don't become obstacles to successful collaborative efforts in the future. The Park Service has a range of authority and support for partnering and collaboration, and it goes back to the very beginning of the National Park Service in 1916, when the National Park Service Organic Act was enacted. But it also includes the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act, which was just signed into law, which encourages partnerships across states and with private citizens. There are laws relating to agreements concerning cooperative research and training on Park Service resources, and the Volunteers in the Parks Act of 1969 also reinforces partnering and collaboration. And we also have a range of NPS policies, like director's orders that cover agreements, donations, land protection, and cooperating association. And there's a section in our management policies from 2006 that cover cooperative conservation beyond park boundaries. So we have a great deal of support and authority to engage in collaboration and partnerships. And we do engage in collaboration and partnerships at a wide variety of scales, including landscape scale conservation programs. So some examples of those are the National Heritage Area programs, regional conservation investments in places like the Chesapeake Bay watershed, international collaborative efforts like that at Glacier National Park in the Crown Managers Partnership, and collaborative conservation along units of the National Trail System, like the 2,400-mile-long Appalachian Trail. And we engage in a range of partnerships that focus on invasive species management, including prevention activities. So at the moment, we are entering into a memorandum of understanding with NASMA, Wildlife Forever, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the goal is to enhance coordination of invasive species prevention messaging across public lands. And so the new agreement will aim to increase the reach of those national prevention campaigns. And we have an example of this in action, actually, through a new installation at Amistad National Recreation Area. They've installed a CD3 unit, which allows visitors to easily engage in prevention activities by washing off boats and boat trailers. And the units also share the message of these national campaigns. We've been involved in conversations about partnering across bureaus and non-governmental organizations on data sharing related to invasive species management. And the goal is to identify what we can share, the best way to share those data across platforms. And I'm going to spend a little more time with our USGS collaboration because this is something we would like to engage land managers in. We've been partnering with USGS to develop tools that would be broadly used by and accessible to land managers. And one of the tools is Inhabit, the invasive species habitat model. And we're also talking with them about the development of a management prioritization tool, which would take into account sites. For the Park Service, that's really important because of the cultural resources that we manage as well as the natural resources. But Inhabit exists and it's out there, and you can go check it at this URL that's below the screenshot, and it uses existing location information for target species, and USGS has identified a suite of national predictors that may be important in controlling species distribution. And this suite of predictors is tailored to the species of concern. They've spent a lot of time researching journal articles and any sort of information that is available on those species to narrow down the predictors to those that are most appropriate to the species. So the location information and the predictors are fed into different algorithms to develop mathematical relationships between where a species is and the environment, and to predict suitability across the landscape. So it's an online tool. Doesn't require any specialized knowledge of GIS or data management to access it. Right now it has over 30 species, and we are going to be including another 100 species over the course of this next year. So this is another opportunity for your input. We're looking for suggestions, but we're also looking for feedback on the tool. So we're looking for people who are interested in testing it out. So some of the questions that we're interested in having answered are, how might the tool be used for planning in the field? Would it be more useful to land managers for identifying potential locations for new invaders, so an early detection opportunity, or for established invaders? Is it going to be more useful on a regional scale or a more local scale? And who should be involved in reviewing the tool to provide feedback? What are some of the top priority tool features? So what should be downloadable, like maps, for example, and what format should they be in? And as I mentioned, there's an opportunity for suggesting new species, and how can we make this tool as useful as possible? So there is a tab within the Inhabit tool where you can submit your feedback. And right now there's active participation from the Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and BLM, and we do hope to include others in that relationship. So again, there's the URL for the Inhabit tool, and I'd urge you all to go online and test it out. And you can also send feedback to Catherine Jarnovich. There's her email on the slide. She's the USGS tech scientist who has helped develop the tool. So there are 17 invasive plant management teams across the country, and they all recognize the importance of protecting resources across jurisdictional boundaries. They all engage in partnerships and collaboration of some form to successfully conduct their work. And some just brief examples include the Alaska Invasive Plant Management Team, which works collaboratively with the Alaska Department of Transportation to control invasive species in the right-of-way areas adjacent to Alaska parks. So they're They're trying to catch species before they enter Park Service lands. The Southwest Invasive Plant Management Team engages in partnerships with local nurseries in Arizona and New Mexico, including the Pueblo at Santa Ana Nursery, to propagate native plant material for restoration. And they're doing some really interesting work in determining the best species for restoration efforts in the area the Southwest Invasive Plant Management Team serves. So I'm going to give you a couple more detailed examples and briefly introduce you to the National Capital Prism, and then I will turn it over to Damien. So the first example is the North Coast Cascades Network Invasive Plant Management Team. One of the park units they serve is Eby's Landing National Historical Reserve, and it's really one of the most unique holdings in the National Park Service. It consists of actively managed farms and dairies and natural woodlands and seaside slopes, and it's surrounded by working farms. So adjacent lands are really important. Whatever happens in Eby's Landing can affect adjacent lands. So this historic reserve is jointly managed by the National Park Service, the Nature Conservancy, Island County, Washington State Parks, and the city of Coopville. Poison hemlock has been a serious concern at the site for a number of years, both because of the environmental impact that the species has and the human health and safety impact that it has. And it has the potential to leave the boundaries of Eby's Landing and impact the local farms that surround the park unit. So prior treatments had focused on emerged plants, and one of the problems with that was that there was a really substantial seed bank, viable seed bank, and plants would germinate throughout the course of the year, which required multiple treatments. So this partnership came together to assess the successes or lack of successes that they'd had in the past. They actually did control the standing plants pretty well, but no effort had been made to control the seed bank. So they developed a new plan to use a pre-emergent imazapic on the seed bank, and in 2018, and the new treatment has been extremely successful. After the initial treatment, the poison hemlock seedlings did not appear they weren't seen 9 months afterwards when the site was visited, and native plants were beginning to recolonize. The Lake Mead Invasive Plant Team was established in 1996, so this is a second example, and it was the model for the National Park Service program. The team has conducted on-the-ground projects with field crews at numerous partner units, 37 Park Service units, but also 15 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, 7 Bureau of Land Management districts, 4 national forests, 2 Bureau of Indian Affairs units, land managed by the Bureau of Reclamation, the Marine Corps Yuma Air Station, and sites managed by state and local entities. So a substantial number of partners engaged with the Lake Mead Invasive Plant Management Team. And 2 of the team's primary goals are to professionalize invasive plant management within the Park Service and within partner organizations by developing staff expertise. And I will say that a lot of invasive plant management professionals have come from the Lake Mead Invasive Plant Management Team. They have trained many people who are now serving in other Park Service sites and other land management sites. Another goal is to improve government efficiencies through interagency cooperation to effectively manage invasive plant species on a landscape scale. And so the Lake Mead team really does work on a watershed scale, working on adjacent lands to the Park Service sites. So partnerships are integral to the team's success by facilitating invasive plant management across agency boundaries. And the team fields up to a 20-person crew, which is really big compared to most of the other invasive plant management teams the Park Service fields. Its location and the many partnerships in the regional area enable a year-round operation that maximizes the team's ability to serve a variety of partners and control a diversity of invasive plants. So the Lake Mead team is a really great example of the kinds of partnerships the Park Service engages in. And the last, I'm just going to briefly introduce the National Capital Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, National Capital PRISM. So the National Capital Area Invasive Plant Management Team was an important partner in establishing the PRISM. And the goal of the PRISM is to encourage cross-border collaboration in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And it grew out of a cooperative weed management area that had been established there. It's a collaborative effort to improve the response to invasive species issues in the region. And it considers all taxa and also operates in the city and the metropolitan area and adjacent counties. So now I am going to turn it over to Damien to give us more details about the National Capital PRISM.
All right. Thank you, Terry. So my name is Damien Ossie, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the District of Columbia, the government of the District of Columbia, in the Fisheries and Wildlife Division in the Department of Energy and Environment. Our division functions a lot like a state agency, like a Department of Natural Resources or a Wildlife Heritage Service. And I'm the chair of the National Capital Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management here in the district. It's actually a regional group now, as Terry said. And I'm also the secretary of the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council and a state representative to the Mid-Atlantic chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration. For hobbies, one of the things I do is I carve wooden spoons, and I try to carve a lot of wooden spoons out of invasive wood. Tree of Heaven and bush honeysuckle being two good ones for making spoons with. So the DC Cooperative Weed Management Area coalesced informally in 2010 with members from the DC government, the Park Service, other federal agencies, and a lot of local conservation organizations. In 2013, we finalized an MOU and a general agreement that was acceptable to both DC government and federal agencies. That took a lot of work. And ultimately, we had 15 signatories from 3 DC government agencies, 4 national park units, 1 university, and several conservation organizations. So we functioned from 2013 to 2017 pretty successfully. We implemented several projects, including a large grant from the Forest Service that gave us a coordinator and 3 summers worth of a summer work cruise. This picture here has this, they were all Student Conservation Association work crews. So here in the picture, we have Park Service, Rock Creek Park, Anna Chukeen from Rock Creek Park instructing one of our crews. We were about to go in and do a bunch of removal in Dumbarton Oaks Park here in DC. The coordinator and the partners implemented several large-scale volunteer events. We started doing training workshops for professionals, initially mostly Park Service employees, and a bunch of training classes for volunteers. And then in 2017, the steering committee voted to try to expand the cooperative weed management area to include the jurisdictions surrounding DC and to expand the scope to include invasive species. And in July 2018, the new National Capital PRISM Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management held a launch event and a brainstorming session at the National Arboretum where we discussed our mission, our objectives, the methods that we'll use, the governance, fundraising, and future projects. Next slide, please. So our mission, the mission of the PRISM is to minimize the adverse impacts of invasive species on ecosystems throughout the DC metro area. The PRISM aims to restore natural habitats and ecosystems and to protect biodiversity by working to eliminate invasive plants in DC and the region through a coordinated effort across political and ecological boundaries. That's something that all of these types of groups try to do. They work across political boundaries because the invasive species ignore those boundaries. Our main objectives are to coordinate invasive species prevention and management, to protect biodiversity, and primarily through a program called Invader Detectives, which I'll talk about later, to raise public awareness of the threats posed by invasive species, and to share data management and techniques. Right now, our members are my agency, the National Capital Region for the Park Service, Fairfax County Park Association, Anacostia Watershed Society, a restoration group called Earth Sangha, and then various other groups like the Washington Area Bicyclist Association, USGS Nuisance Aquatic Species Group, the Potomac Research Center out of George Mason, and several other groups. We still need to get a lot of the counties and municipalities involved and signed on to the partnership. But right now we have a good functioning steering committee, and those are the current members. Next slide, please. So I've been doing this for a pretty long while, and we're starting to analyze how we work and how we work well. And there's a lot of information out there about how these types of groups work. They typically operate within a defined geographic area, and they involve a broad cross-section of partners. Important here is to include all the landowners, or as many landowners as you can. So they facilitate cooperation and coordination. They involve a long-term commitment, and they're governed by a steering committee. The keys here are the long-term commitment from all of the partners and good governance through the steering committee. Next slide, please. And how these groups work well. I left CWMAs here, but this includes PRISMs and types of groups called CISMAs, which are cooperative invasive species management areas. So you need to have frequent high visibility collaborative events and projects. You have to do a lot of outreach events and volunteer projects, a lot of collaboration, especially with large scale events and research within the groups. And then securing funding with and for multiple partners. Implicit in all of this is a lot of really good leadership that's necessary. I can't stress enough how much it requires good leadership to get these off the ground and running smoothly. And that's really useful if you can get a good coordinator. And then another really important thing is participation and engagement of the steering committee and of other members, which can lead to all these other things, massive amounts of outreach and as much engagement and participation of the public as possible. We really need to get into true collaboration, which goes back to the participation of the members, the steering committee leadership, and all the other members. It really takes a lot to get the full participation from all of those groups, and that requires good leadership. And then there's this little thing called funding, which is usually pretty helpful. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but we've actually successfully gotten some funding for these groups, and I'll go into a little bit what our most recent grant is. Next slide, please. So we have a number of ongoing projects and events that started when we were a cooperative weed management area, and they've continued as we've turned into a PRISM. And for the most part, these are still focusing on invasive plant species, but some of these projects have started to include some invasive animals, such as information about the spotted lanternfly and some other invasive or forest pests. The one thing we've done very pretty much every year with 1 or 2 events per year since 2013 is this professional herbicide licensure recertification training. We've been doing that for a long time. We typically get between 60 and 80 people at these events. They come from, initially they were mostly Park Service employees, but we've really expanded to include a lot of the seasonal employees from all of our surrounding jurisdictions. And even some of the for-profit groups that do invasive plant management have sent people to get recertified. Next slide, please. And we also offer several times a year, we offer training classes for what are called weed warriors. I'm not sure if everyone has these, but in the DC area, there are several jurisdictions that certify volunteers to work independently in their parks. Rock Creek Park does it, that's a National Park Service unit, and then Montgomery County Parks and Fairfax County Parks both have similar programs within their systems. This is just a picture from one of our events that we held. This is collaborative class with Anacostia Watershed Society, National Park Service, my agency, and the Casey Trees Foundation. So it's 4 different members from the PRISM. Next project, please. Next slide, please. Some of our new and upcoming projects. We just were awarded a grant from the National Environmental Education Foundation, and that's going to fund a coordinator and some summer work crews for the PRISM. The main thing that we're going to try to do is to stand up this program called Invader Detectives. This was developed by Mark Frey, who is the IPMT liaison for the Southern region now, I think. He was with the National Capital Region. And this is a citizen science program. It's a national program that facilitates the detection and eradication of potentially harmful non-native organisms in urban environments. It's administrated through partnerships between government agencies and citizen scientists, and it includes members of the public who have sufficient technical capacity to contribute to these scientific endeavors, and they do so voluntarily. That just means that they're citizen scientists. On the back end, Invader Detective produces alerts for reports of novel species from a number of federal databases and citizen science platforms. And then what we call uninteresting reports are filtered out. These are species that are native or species that are common invasive species. So we're looking for, in Invader Detectives, we're looking for the early detection rapid response species. These alerts produce watch lists that we can go over and then distribute to the users and to organizations within the PRISM. We haven't really stood up Invader Detectives yet within the National Capital PRISM, but the program has extensive documentation that Mark Frey put together for doing so. So once we have a coordinator, we can really start to stand up that program and doing outreach to different organizations. And the goal is to get people who are already out in the field, amateur botanists, members of native plant societies, anglers, birders, groups that are already out there doing this sort of, doing observations. And then also under the grant, we're going to try to expand training opportunities for professionals and for volunteers. Hope to greatly expand our outreach capacity. And then we're going to try to, the goal is to eradicate this new water chestnut called Trappa bispinosa, which has showed up in the Potomac River just south of the district and in a number of ponds and lakes in Northern Virginia. And then we're going to have a crew that's going to respond to reports, early detection and rapid response species, so that they can both go out and inventory for populations and then do eradication work throughout the region. Next slide, please. I think that's the last slide. And I just wanted to say that hopefully I made it clear how big a role the Park Service has played in our organization. They were a big partner, one of the major partners starting off. If you don't know the District of Columbia, most of our natural areas are National Park Service units. So any work that we want to do to manage invasive species, we typically had to coordinate with the Park Service and work closely with the Park Service. I've been out in the mud managing dragon hose through Phragmites in Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, and now it's great to be expanding into some of our regional our greater part of our region so that we can expand this program. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. So that really is an overview of some of the kinds of partnerships and collaborations that the National Park Service engages in. And I wanted to take this opportunity to announce to this group that the National Park Service's Invasive Plant Management Team program is observing 20 years of action in 2020. It was created, the first teams were on the ground in the year 2000, and so we have a range of events that are scheduled for 2020 to in observation of the anniversary. And so one of the first things that I should tell you, because you have seen it throughout this slide presentation, that we have undergone a name change, which is a rather simple one, replacing the word exotic for invasive. And this is to be in keeping with the executive orders on invasive species, which define invasive as, with regard to a particular ecosystem, a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. So that is a big change, and we are in the process of developing a visual identity for the program associated with that change, but also to more closely link the teams with the fact that they are National Park Service employees, and that's been a little bit challenging without a logo that pulls us all together. As part of the 20th anniversary, the program is undergoing a review, and that has two pieces to it. The first is a review through assessment questionnaires that are have been sent out to internal stakeholders with a deadline of response by November 25th. So there's a questionnaire has been developed for parks that host or are served by an invasive plant management team, parks that aren't served by an invasive plant management team, internal invasive plant management team staff, and then one for regional office staff who play a support role to the parks. The results of that work, this effort is based upon one that was conducted after the program had reached its 10-year anniversary, and a lot of the questions come directly from that review. We'll analyze the results and develop recommendations for program alterations as a consequence of the input that we get. But that data will also be shared with a budget scenario planning task force that has been in existence since February or March of 2019. And the task force will be using the structured decision-making process to review the program. The reason for this is that over the past 20 years, there have been a lot of scientific advances in our understanding of how to manage invasive species. There have been shifts in disturbance regimes, changing climate, the arrival and spread of new invasive plant species, and shifting leadership priorities. So the goal is to address these changes and help the Park Service be more proactive in the face of budget and environmental uncertainties. So the scenario planning task force will develop recommendations to put forward to the program and to the program management that is adaptable to a range of conditions, resources, and limitations across the National Park Service. And the goal is to have recommendations for program decision makers by March 31st, 2020. We have a lot of outreach activities going on right now, which includes, we've developed a poster that highlights the team and the team's accomplishments that will be sent out to parks. We have a poster that is making the rounds of the professional meetings to talk about the history of the program and the direction the program is heading. There'll be social media posts and articles on the website, as well as a short video will be produced. We're planning an all-team on-the-ground project to assist a park or parks with a difficult invasive plant management challenge that surmounts their ability to manage it, and an alumni event where we will be inviting people who have been involved in the program since its inception to get together and share their stories about the invasive plant management program. And we're putting together a program history so that we have all of this in writing at some point in time that we can share with others. And that will likely be at the end of 2020 or early 2021. And I think with that, we are open for questions, and I'm going to move to the last slide, which has the contact information for myself and for Damien, if anyone wants to follow up with questions later.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. So do we have any questions from any of our attendees? I can unmute all of you, and you are more than welcome to type a question in on the right-hand side. And it doesn't appear as though we have any questions yet. As Terri has said, she has provided her contact information along with Damien's in this slide. Please feel free to write this information down or reach out to NASMA at nasma.org if you have any questions or would like some follow-up. And if there are no questions, I guess we can call this meeting to an end. Thank you so much for your time, Terri and Damien. This was a wonderful presentation, and this is recorded and will be available on the nasma.org website, and all of our previous websites are available to current NASMA members. So we invite you to check out that webpage and see if NASMA is a good fit for you. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.